The dust of Gallows Ridge settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated the souls of men as thoroughly as it did their boots. It was a town built on the knife's edge between hope and despair, where the clang of the blacksmith's hammer was often drowned out by the creak of the gallows frame in a high wind. Inside the First Territorial Bank, the air was still and thick with the smell of old paper and stale tobacco. Silas Blackwater stood at the teller's cage, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow in the afternoon light. He was a man carved from the rugged land. He owned his face, a roadmap of hard years and unspoken sorrow. The withdrawal was a familiar ritual funds for the month's wages and supplies for his sprawling ranch. He counted the bills with the slow, deliberate movements of a man for whom time had lost its urgency. He slid the worn leather satchel across the polished wood just as the double doors of the bank burst inward with a splintering crash. 3 men, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, stormed the room. They moved with a brutal economy of motion, 2 fanning out to cover the customers, while their leader strode directly to the center of the floor. He was taller than the others, his movements possessing a cold reptilian grace. On the floor, the leader's voice was not a shout, but a low, menacing command that cut through the initial shock and sent a wave of panicked compliance through the room. Men and women dropped to the rough-hewn planks, their faces a mixture of fear and resignation. Silas moved with them, his mind honed by years as a cavalry officer assessing the threat. They were professionals. No wasted motion, no nervous energy. Their leader directed the operation with hand signals, a silent ballet of violence. As one of the robbers began stuffing cash into a canvas sack, the leader's gaze swept the room, his eyes cold and dark above the cloth, missing nothing. They fell on Silas. Silas had landed hard, and the impact had dislodged a small silver locket from his waistcoat pocket. It lay on the floor beside his hand, its polished surface gleaming against the dirty wood. It was a simple heart-shaped piece, worn smooth by the touch of his fingers over 5 long years. Inside were the miniature portraits of his wife Maria and his daughter Emma. The leader stepped toward him, his boots unnervingly silent on the floorboards. He ignored the leather satchel of money at Silas's side. Instead, he bent down, his attention fixed solely on the locket. He picked it up not with the greedy haste of a common thief, but with a strange, almost reverent curiosity. He turned it over in his gloved fingers, his thumb tracing the worn edges. For a long, tense moment, he just studied it. Silas could feel the man's focus, a palpable, invasive force. Then the leader's eyes lifted from the locket and met Silas's. A look of strange personal recognition flickered in their depths, followed by something akin to contempt. A low, humorless sound, not quite a laugh, escaped him. He didn't pocket the locket for its value. He held it up as if displaying a trophy, a sneer twisting the visible portion of his mouth. Some things, the man said, his voice a venomous whisper, meant only for Silas, can never be replaced. With that he turned, signaled his men, and they were gone, melting back into the dusty streets of Gallows Ridge as quickly as they had appeared. The robbery had lasted less than 3 minutes. They had taken the bank's money, but for Silas Blackwater, they had stolen something far more precious. The man whose name he would later learn was Jeremiah. Cain had not just committed a crime, he had desecrated a memory. He had looked into the heart of Silas's grief and mocked it. As the other customers began to stir, Silas remained on the floor, his large hand clenched into a fist where the locket should have been, a cold, hollow ache spreading through his chest, awakening a part of him that had been dormant for 5 long years. The ride back to the Blackwater Ranch was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. The 10,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land, once a source of pride, now felt like a vast, empty stage. The wind whispered through the tall grass, a mournful sound that echoed the silence in his own heart. He rode past the garden Maria had tended with such care, now a tangled riot of weeds and faded blooms, a testament to a life left untended. He didn't glance at it. He hadn't for years. He dismounted in the yard, and the solid two-story house looming before him like a fortress built to keep the world out. But the walls had failed. The emptiness was already inside. He entered the kitchen, the familiar scent of wood smoke and Martha's baking doing nothing to dispel the chill that had settled deep in his bones. Martha Kellens, his housekeeper, stood at the stove, her sturdy frame a constant, reassuring presence in the shifting landscape of his life. She had been with the family for 15 years, a young widow who had become the backbone of the household. She had grieved alongside him for Emma, and had quietly taken over the management of his life when Maria passed, never asking for thanks, only offering quiet competence. She looked at him now, her keen eyes taking in his rigid posture and the new hard set of his jaw. She saw the missing locket but said nothing, understanding that some wounds were too deep for words. "Dinner will be ready in an hour, Mr. Silas," was all she said. Her voice was practical, a small anchor of normalcy in the swirling chaos of his thoughts. He nodded, unable to speak, and walked through the silent house. He passed the parlor where Maria's piano stood shrouded in a white sheet, its keys untouched since the day her music died. He climbed the stairs, his boots loud on the wooden steps, each one a drumbeat, marking the passage of another empty day. He stopped outside a closed door. His hand hesitated on the brass knob before pushing it open. Emma's room was a shrine perfectly preserved against the ravages of time and dust. The small bed with its patchwork quilt remained exactly as Martha had made it on that final morning. The collection of picture books sat on the shelf, their stories frozen in time. On the bedside table sat a small wooden horse, its lines simple but full of life, a piece he had carved with his own hands during a long winter afternoon. He walked to the table and picked it up. The wood was smooth and cool in his calloused palm. He remembered the feel of Emma's small hand in his as he'd guided her fingers over the carving. He remembered her laughter, a sound so clear in his memory it was almost a physical pain. Now the room felt cold. The memories were ghosts, transparent and without warmth. The grief was no longer a sharp, tearing agony. It had become a dull, permanent ache, the foundation upon which he had rebuilt his life. A clatter of hooves in the yard announced another arrival. Through the window, Silas saw his brother Caleb dismounting from his horse. Caleb Blackwater was the town merchant, a man whose easy smile and gregarious nature stood in stark contrast to Silas's grim stoicism. He owned the mercantile, served on the town council, and moved through life with a cheerful pragmatism that had become a source of friction between the brothers. Silas went downstairs to meet him on the porch. The tension was immediate, a familiar wall built of unspoken resentments and divergent paths. "Heard what happened," Caleb said, forgoing a greeting. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Silas replied, his voice flat. "Just fine, Silas. They held a gun on you. That man. They say he looked you right in the eye." "He did." Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I know we haven't been close. Not since Maria. But you're still my brother. If you need anything." "I don't need anything." Silas cut him off, the words sharper than intended. He saw a flash of hurt in Caleb's eyes before it was replaced by a weary frustration. "You never do you?" Caleb's voice was low. "You've built this fortress around yourself, Silas. This ranch, this silence. You think it's protecting you, but it's just a prison. Emma and Maria are gone. You're allowed to live again. Don't you speak their names." Silas's voice was a low growl. "You don't know anything about it." "I know I lost a sister-in-law and a niece I adored." Caleb shot back, his cheerfulness finally cracking. and I'm watching my brother bury himself alive. I try, Silas. I keep trying to reach you, but you won't let anyone in." He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "The offer stands, if you change your mind." Silas watched him ride away, the dust settling in his wake. He knew Caleb meant well, but his words felt like stones thrown against the thick walls of his grief. He preferred the silence. The silence didn't ask questions. It didn't demand hope. It simply was. He retreated back into the house, the vast, quiet space that was both his kingdom and his tomb, and prepared to face another long, empty evening. The storm rolled in from the west, a dark bruise on the horizon that slowly bled across the twilight sky. Wind rattled the window panes and moaned around the eaves of the house, a lonely sound that suited Silas's mood. He sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk beside him, listening to the approaching squall. It was on nights like this that the ghosts felt closest, their whispers carried on the rising wind. A sudden frantic knocking at the front door startled him from his reverie. It wasn't the polite rap of a neighbor, but a desperate, panicked drumming that was nearly lost in the first crash of thunder. Martha was in her quarters at the back of the house. She wouldn't have heard it. With a weary sigh, Silas rose and went to the door, pulling his pistol from the desk drawer as he went. Trouble rarely came calling so late or so politely. He opened the door to a wall of wind and driving rain. And there, caught in the yellow lamplight spilling from the house, was a child. She was small, no older than 7, her dress little more than rags, her face and hands covered in a thick layer of soot that made her eyes seem unnaturally large and dark. She stood shivering, not from the cold alone, but from a terror that seemed to radiate from her small frame. She looked up at him, her lips parted, but no sound came out. Then her legs gave way and she crumpled onto the porch in a heap. Silas holstered his pistol and scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of wet rags and fragile bones. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm, and laid her gently on the rug in front of the hearth. Martha, roused by the commotion, appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of alarm. "Merciful heavens, Mr. Silas, where did she come from?" "The storm brought her," Silas said, his voice rough. "Get a blanket and some warm milk and bread." While Martha bustled in the kitchen, Silas gently wiped the soot from the child's face with a damp cloth. Beneath the grime was a delicate face, pale and pinched with exhaustion, but with a stubborn set to her small chin. Her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and intelligent, and for a moment they held the wild, cornered look of a frightened animal. Then they focused on his face, and the fear was tempered by a desperate, pleading hope. Martha returned with a thick wool blanket and a tray of food. She wrapped the child snugly and held a cup of warm milk to her lips. The girl drank with a desperate thirst. When Martha offered her a piece of bread, she devoured it, her small hands shaking, not pausing, until every last crumb was gone. Throughout it all, she clutched a small, tightly sewn leather bundle against her chest, her knuckles white. She refused to let it go, even for a moment. After she had eaten, a little color returned to her cheeks. She sat propped against the hearth, the blanket wrapped around her like a cocoon, and finally found her voice. It was a hoarse whisper, raw from smoke and disuse. "They burned it all," she said, her gaze fixed on the fire. "The wagon. Mama. Papa." Her story came out in fragmented, nightmarish bursts. A wagon fire, shouting in the dark, men she called shadow men moving through the flames. Her father's last words, an urgent command to run and hide and not come back until morning. "What is your name, child?" Silas asked, his voice softer than he'd intended. "Ruby," she whispered. Taking her in was not an easy decision. His life was a carefully constructed fortress of solitude. A child, especially a child so deeply wounded, was a complication he was not equipped to handle. The orphanage in Cedar Falls was the sensible choice, the legal choice. But as he looked at the soot-covered girl huddled by his fire, clutching her mysterious bundle, he saw more than just an orphan. He saw a survivor. He saw a flicker of the same defiant strength he had once seen in his own daughter's eyes. "You can stay here tonight, Ruby," he said, the words feeling momentous, a crack forming in the wall of his self-imposed isolation. "We'll sort things out in the morning." Ruby looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She seemed to find what she was looking for. She gave a single solemn nod. The reluctant act of decency was done. Silas Blackwater, a man who had sworn off hope, had just let it walk through his front door. The storm raged outside, but for the first time in 5 years, the silence inside the house felt a little less absolute. The arrival of Caleb the doctor and the Reverend the next morning felt less like a visit of concern and more like a formal inquiry. They found Silas and Ruby in the kitchen, the low light of the overcast day filtering through the rain-lashed windows. Ruby, now clean and dressed in one of Emma's old altered dresses, sat at the table methodically working her way through a bowl of Martha's porridge. The 3 men, large and rough in their wet coats, seemed to shrink the room, their presence a stark contrast to the small, silent child at its center. Caleb was the first to speak, his voice stripped of its usual cheer, replaced by a pragmatic urgency. "Silas, you can't just keep a child you found by the road. There are laws, procedures." "The law can wait," Silas replied, his tone clipped and defensive. He stood by the stove, a cup of coffee held in both hands, his posture a protective wall between the visitors and Ruby. "The child needed shelter. I provided it." Dr. Henderson, a kind man, burdened by the sorrows of his profession, stepped forward. "Silas, let me at least examine her. After what she's been through." He looked at Ruby, his voice softening. "It won't take long, little one." Silas nodded. Martha gently led a hesitant Ruby into the adjoining pantry, leaving the men alone. The atmosphere grew thick with unspoken judgment. Reverend Morrison, a man whose piety was as solid as the oak of his church pews, spoke next. "Your compassion is admirable, Silas. But your brother is right. The child belongs in the care of those equipped to handle such trauma. The orphanage is a warehouse for unwanted children," Silas cut in, his voice dangerously low. "She stays here." "For how long?" Caleb pressed. "What do you know about her? What if her family comes looking for her?" "Her family is dead." The simple, brutal statement hung in the air. Before Caleb could argue further, Ruby's voice, small but clear, drifted from the pantry. She was answering the doctor's questions, recounting her ordeal. "The men who came, they had a leader," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He didn't shout like the others. He had a voice like a snake." The phrase struck Silas like a physical blow. A voice like a snake. It was a perfect description of the cold, venomous whisper of the man in the bank, the man who had stolen Emma's locket. A flicker of recognition, a terrible and unwelcome connection ignited in his mind. The bank robbery and this child's tragedy were not separate events. They were pieces of the same dark puzzle. Dr. Henderson and Ruby returned to the kitchen. The doctor gave Silas a grim nod. "She's exhausted and undernourished, but physically unharmed. Miraculously." Ruby went immediately to Silas's side, her small hand finding his. The gesture, so simple and trusting, solidified his resolve. These men, with their laws and their conventional wisdom, did not understand. This was no longer about simple charity. "She is staying with me." Silas declared his voice, leaving no room for argument. He looked at each man in turn, his pragmatic brother, the kind doctor, the pious reverend. This is her home now. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me. He had drawn a line in the sand. By choosing to protect this child, he had set himself against the town, against the law, against the quiet, orderly life he had so carefully constructed. And as he felt Ruby's small hand tighten its grip on his, he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the men with voices like snakes would be coming for her. The next few weeks were a delicate dance of investigation and rising tension. Silas rode into town and filed the preliminary guardianship papers, a formal declaration of his intent that set tongues wagging all over Gallows Ridge. At the Mercantile, Caleb confirmed that the bank robbers were still believed to be in the territory, their brazenness suggesting they felt untouchable. It was there, while waiting for supplies, that Silas overheard two ranchers talking in low voices about Sheriff Patterson, how he'd been seen meeting with well-dressed strangers late at night on the edge of town. A detail that planted a seed of suspicion that would soon grow into a thorny vine of corruption. Back at the ranch, life settled into a new, fragile routine. One evening, while mending the dress, Ruby had arrived and Martha's needle hit something hard. Sewn meticulously into the hem was the small leather bundle Ruby had so fiercely protected. She brought it to Silas, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Inside, they found a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled not with words, but with a complex series of numbers and symbols. Silas, who had served as a signals officer in the army, recognized it immediately. It was a military-style cipher designed to be unbreakable without the proper key. He sat with Ruby at the kitchen table, the journal open between them. "Ruby," he asked gently, "did your father ever teach you any special phrases, a poem or saying about your family?" She frowned in concentration, her small brow furrowed. Then her eyes lit up. He did. He always said, "For my Rose and my Ruby, all things are possible." Mama's name was Rose. It was the key. Working late into the night by the light of a kerosene lamp, they began the slow, painstaking process of decoding the journal. As the symbols gave way to words, a story began to emerge. The first pages contained detailed land surveys and geological notes. But as they progressed, the entries became more cryptic, more dangerous. Ruby's father, James Fletcher, had been documenting a massive conspiracy. There were notes about bribes paid to local officials, illegal land sales on reservation territory, and coded references to a man identified only by the initials J.C. The quiet period of investigation was shattered a week later. Martha had taken Ruby into town for supplies. Silas had insisted she take one of the ranch hands, a steady man named Frank, for protection. He was shoeing a horse in the barn when he heard the frantic gallop of a single rider approaching the ranch. It was Frank, his face pale, his horse lathered. "Mr. Blackwater, it's Ruby in town," he gasped. Two men tried to take her right in the middle of the market. Silas didn't wait for details. He saddled his fastest horse, his mind a cold, calculating machine. The 20-minute ride to Gallows Ridge felt like an eternity. He found them outside Caleb's Mercantile, a small crowd gathered around a shaken Martha, who held a crying Ruby tightly in her arms. Two men stood opposite them, their expressions a mixture of frustration and menace. Silas recognized one of them instantly. He was one of the bank robbers. Silas dismounted his movements, calm and deliberate, but his eyes were chips of gray ice. He walked directly to the men, placing himself between them and his family. "There seems to be a problem here." Silas said, his voice deceptively mild. "No problem," the robber sneered. Just collecting something that was lost. The girl belongs with us. The girl belongs with me, Silas stated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority in his tone, backed by the hand resting near the butt of his Colt, was more potent than any shout. The man's eyes flickered, weighing his options. The market was full of witnesses. A public gunfight was not part of their plan. He looked past Silas to Ruby, his voice dropping to a low threat. This isn't over, old man. You should give up what isn't yours. The threat was now public. Dangerous. As the men backed away and disappeared into an alley, Silas knelt before Ruby, his large hands gently cupping her face. Are you all right, sweetheart? She nodded, wiping her tears, her small body still trembling. He said my papa was a thief, and I had to pay his debts. The lie was meant to poison her, to break the trust she had placed in him. But as Silas looked into her dark, defiant eyes, he saw not doubt, but a strengthening resolve. He had made a promise to protect this child. Now the entire town of Gallows Ridge was a witness to that vow and to the danger that came with it. The shadows were no longer content to wait on the horizon. They had stepped into the light. The day after the confrontation in town, a rider approached the ranch. He did not come with the skulking menace of a hired gun, but with the confident posture of a man who believed the world belonged to him. He rode a fine black stallion and was dressed in the expensive tailored suit of a city businessman. As he drew closer, Silas felt a cold dread grip him. It was the leader from the bank, the man with the voice like a snake. Jeremiah Kane. He dismounted and walked to the porch, removing his hat, with a gesture of mock courtesy. He ignored the rifle Silas held loosely in his hands. Mr. Blackwater Kane, said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished stone. My name is Jeremiah Kane. I believe you have something that belongs to my family. He produced a set of documents from his coat pocket bound in legal ribbon. These are custody papers signed by a territorial judge. They name me as the legal guardian of my distant cousin, Ruby Fletcher. Silas's grip tightened on the rifle. The papers were clearly forgeries, but they were official-looking enough to cause serious trouble. Ruby has no family left, Silas said, his voice flat. Kane smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. A common mistake. Her branch of the family was estranged. But with the tragic death of her parents, it falls to me to care for the poor orphan. He looked past Silas toward the house. You've been very kind to take her in, but your charity is no longer required. The man's arrogance was breathtaking. He stood on Silas's porch, the murderer of Ruby's parents, calmly demanding she be handed over. It was then that Kane's gaze drifted, catching on a detail of the porch railing, a small, intricate notch that Silas had carved years ago to mark Emma's height on her 5th birthday. Kane's eyes narrowed slightly. You're a man who pays attention to details, I see. A valuable trait. It reminds me of a time long ago. A cavalry campaign, wasn't it, near the Cimarron River 20 years back? The words hit Silas like a physical blow. It was an obscure campaign, a footnote in the Army's long, bloody history on the frontier. A brutal, thankless series of skirmishes against a renegade band. Our unit was tasked with a difficult objective. Kane continued, his voice dropping, taking on a venomous, storytelling quality. There was a settlement, squatters mostly. Families who refused to leave contested land. The official report called it a necessary sacrifice. Your unit was ordered to create a diversion to draw the renegades into a trap. But the fire spread, didn't it, Blackwater? It spread to the settlement. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered the smoke the screams carried on the wind, the terrible, sickening feeling of a tactical decision gone horribly wrong. He had followed orders. They had all followed orders. Kane's calm demeanor finally cracked, revealing the raw, festering wound beneath. His voice was thick with a hatred that had been simmering for 2 decades. My family was in that settlement. My mother, my father, my little sister. They weren't squatters. They were pioneers. And your necessary sacrifice burned them alive. I was the only one who survived. The revelation reshaped the world around Silas. This wasn't about land. It wasn't about a coded journal. This was a vendetta. I watched you ride away that day. Kane hissed, his composure gone. The heroic cavalry officer already forgetting the collateral damage. I swore then that one day I would take everything from you. Not just your life, but your legacy, your land, your precious honor. This whole scheme, the land, the bribes, Patterson, it's all been for you. A way to destroy everything you and the government you serve stand for. Fletcher just got in the way. He looked toward the house again, and a cruel understanding dawned in his eyes. And now fate delivers to me the chance to take the one thing you might have left to care about. The fight was no longer about protecting an orphan. It was a deeply personal war born from the ashes of a long-forgotten tragedy. Jeremiah Kane hadn't come for land or money. He had come for Silas's soul, seeking to repay a debt of grief with an ocean of his own. With the true nature of the conflict laid bare, Jeremiah Kane unleashed the full force of his influence. He was no common outlaw. He was a wealthy, powerful man who had spent years weaving a web of corruption throughout the territory. He began to pull on the strings, and Silas's world started to unravel. The next day, Sheriff Patterson, now openly on Kane's payroll, rode out to the ranch. He was not alone. He was flanked by 2 deputies Silas had never seen before, men with hard eyes and guns worn low on their hips. Patterson served Silas with a court order signed by a complicit judge demanding he surrender custody of Ruby Fletcher to her legal guardian, Jeremiah Kane. "It's the law," Silas, Patterson said, avoiding his eyes. "You have 24 hours. When Silas refused, the pressure escalated. A notice arrived from the First Territorial Bank, the same bank Kane had robbed, calling in all of Silas's outstanding loans, due in full within 30 days. It was a financial blow, designed to cripple him, to force him to sell his land. His land, the very thing Kane intended to steal. The intimidation spread to his men. Ranch hands who had been with him for years were cornered in town, threatened. Their families received anonymous warnings. One by one they came to Silas, their faces etched with apology and fear. Most of them quit, leaving him with only Martha and 2 of his most loyal, oldest hands. The final betrayal, or so it seemed, came from his own blood. Caleb sought him out in town, his expression grave. Their conversation took place on the boardwalk in front of the Mercantile, in full view of the townspeople. "Silas, you have to give her up." Caleb urged, his voice loud enough for onlookers to hear. "You can't fight this. Kane has the law on his side. He has money influence. You're risking everything, the ranch, your life, for a child who isn't even yours. For your own safety, obey the court order." The words were a public condemnation, an abandonment. The sight of the Blackwater brothers divided seemed to be the final straw for the town. Doors that had once been open to Silas, now closed. Faces that had been friendly now turned away. He was an outcast, a stubborn old man clinging to a lost cause. He and Ruby were besieged, trapped on the ranch. They were isolated legally, financially, and socially. Every evening they would see the distant campfires of Kane's men, a ring of predators patiently waiting for their moment to strike. The vast ranch, once a symbol of his success, had become their prison. Silas was a true underdog, a lone man standing against a rigged system with nothing left to protect but a small, brave girl and the tattered remains of his honor. A massive storm, the kind that scours the land clean, rolled in on the third night of the siege. The sky turned a bruised purple-black, and a furious wind tore at the house, shrieking like a banshee. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets, turning the ranch yard into a treacherous sea of mud and sludge. It was the perfect cover for an attack. They came just after midnight. A flash of lightning illuminated them. For a heart-stopping second, a dozen riders moving through the storm like wraiths, their rifles glinting in the chaotic light. The assault began with a volley of gunfire that shattered the parlor windows. The battle for the Blackwater Ranch had begun. It was a desperate, sprawling fight. Silas, with his two remaining hands, returned fire from the fortified windows of the house. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. The fight spilled from the house to the outbuildings, a running battle through the mud and darkness. One of his men went down a cry, swallowed by a crack of thunder. Silas and his last hand, a grizzled old-timer named Jed, fell back to the barn, the last defensible position. Ruby and Martha were huddled in the root cellar beneath the kitchen, the safest place on the ranch. As Silas slammed the heavy barn doors shut, he knew they were trapped. It was then through the howl of the storm that he heard it more gunfire, but from a different direction. A new group of riders was charging into the fray, attacking Kane's men from the flank. For a wild moment, Silas thought it was a posse from town, a change of heart from his neighbors. But as one of the riders fought his way through the chaos toward the barn, another flash of lightning revealed his face. It was Caleb. He slid off his horse and crashed through the side door of the barn, dripping wet and breathing hard. He wasn't dressed like a town merchant. He wore a federal marshal's badge on his coat. "What in God's name?" Silas began. "No time." Caleb shouted over the storm. "My public disapproval was a ruse, brother. A way to stay off Kane's radar while I gathered the final evidence and called in the marshals. They're on their way, but we have to hold them off." The secondary twist was a jolt of pure adrenaline, of renewed hope. They were no longer alone. As Caleb took up a position at a window, but the main barn doors splintered and burst inward. Jeremiah Kane stood there framed against the storm, his face a mask of demonic fury. His men poured in behind him. Jed fell in the first volley. It was down to the two brothers against Kane and his remaining men. The final confrontation took place in the cavernous, hay-filled space of the barn. It devolved into a brutal close-quarters fight amidst the terrified screams of the horses in their stalls. Silas found himself face to face with Kane. It was not a gunfight, but a raw physical struggle in the mud and muck of the barn floor. As they wrestled, Kane's voice was a venomous rasp in his ear, forcing Silas to confront the ghosts of his past. "This is for my family, Blackwater. For the screams I heard in the fire you started." They crashed against a stall, the wood groaning in protest. Kane, surprisingly strong, gained the upper hand, pressing a knife to Silas's throat. "I have a choice for you, cavalryman." Kane hissed, his breath hot and ragged. He gestured with his head toward a leather satchel one of his men had dropped. "In that bag is the evidence Fletcher gathered. The names of my superiors, the politicians, the railroad barons in Washington. It's all there. Let me walk out of here with it, and the girl lives. I'll be gone forever. Kill me, and my associates will walk free. The conspiracy survives. What's it to be, Blackwater revenge or redemption?" The moral dilemma was a blade sharper than the one at his throat. Kill the man who murdered Ruby's parents and haunted his past, or let him go to protect the future. In that moment, looking into the black eyes of the man his actions had created 2 decades ago. Silas made his choice. Suddenly, a small figure darted from behind a stack of hay bales. It was Ruby. She must have slipped out of the cellar, drawn by the sounds of the fight. With a cry of pure childish rage, she threw a heavy wooden bucket with all her might. It struck Kane squarely in the side of the head. The blow was not powerful, but it was a vital distraction. Kane's grip loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all Silas needed. He twisted, wrenching the knife from Kane's grasp and driving his fist into the man's jaw. Kane staggered back. Silas didn't go for a kill. He chose redemption. He slammed a heavy feed scoop against the back of Kane's knees, buckling them, then brought the heavy wooden handle down in a sharp, incapacitating blow to his shoulder. Kane crumpled to the ground, screaming in pain, his fighting arm useless. Silas had secured both the man and the evidence. As Caleb and his arriving marshals subdued the last of Kane's men, Silas rushed to Ruby, scooping her into his arms, his heart hammering against his ribs. She clung to him, trembling, but her eyes were fierce. She had not been a victim. She had been a warrior. As the first light of dawn broke, the storm began to subside. The battered ranch was filled with the quiet, efficient movements of federal marshals. Led by a stern-faced Judge Cross, whom Caleb had alerted days before, they took a captured and seething Jeremiah Kane and his men into custody. The muddy yard was a scene of quiet exhaustion and profound relief. The doctor who had arrived with the marshals moved among the wounded, his presence a calm counterpoint to the night's violence. Silas, bruised, bloody but resolute, sat on the porch steps. Ruby was wrapped in a thick wool blanket curled against his side, her eyes wide as she watched the dawn paint the bruised sky with streaks of pale pink and gold. The world washed clean by the storm felt new. Caleb approached, a cup of steaming coffee in each hand. He handed one to Silas and sat down on the step beside him. For a long moment they said nothing, just watching the marshals work, listening to the drip of water from the eaves. The years of misunderstanding, of silence and perceived betrayal hung between them, waiting to be cleared away. "You should have told me," Silas finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "I couldn't," Caleb replied softly. "Not without putting you in even more danger." Kane had eyes everywhere. If he'd known who I was, he would have killed us both long ago. I had to let you think I'd abandoned you. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Silas looked at his brother, seeing not the cheerful town merchant, but a dedicated, lonely man who had been fighting a secret war for years. He saw the weight Caleb had carried, the risk he had taken. "You saved us, Caleb." "No," Caleb said, shaking his head. "You saved her. You gave her a reason to trust again. You gave us all something to fight for. I just brought the cavalry." He clapped Silas on the shoulder, a gesture of reconciliation that spoke more than words. Years of distance dissolved in that quiet moment on the porch. The fight they had just survived had reforged their bond, burning away the dross of resentment and leaving only the pure, strong metal of brotherhood. They were brothers again, watching the sun rise on a world they had together made safe. 6 months later, spring had laid a gentle green hand upon the land. Life at the Blackwater Ranch had found a new, more hopeful rhythm. Thanks to the evidence in James Fletcher's journal and the capture of Jeremiah Kane, the entire corruption network had been dismantled. Sheriff Patterson was serving a long sentence in a federal prison, and the stolen lands were being returned to their rightful owners. Justice, slow but sure, had been served. Ruby was thriving. She was no longer a haunted, soot-covered wraith, but a bright, curious girl on the cusp of a new life. Judge Cross had arranged for a private tutor, and Ruby attacked her lessons with the same fierce determination she had shown in the face of her enemies. Laughter, a sound Silas had thought extinct in his house, now echoed in its halls. One clear, warm afternoon, Silas took Ruby by the hand and led her up the small, windswept hill behind the ranch house. At its crest stood two simple headstones, marking the place where he had buried Maria and Emma. For 5 years, this place had been a sanctuary of pain, a site he could not visit without being consumed by the suffocating weight of his grief. Now he stood before the graves, Ruby's small hand in his, and felt not sorrow, but a quiet, profound peace. "This is where my Emma and her mama are resting," he said softly. He told Ruby about his daughter, about her bright smile and her love for the small wooden horses he carved. He spoke of her not as a ghost, but as a cherished memory, a part of his past that had made him the man he was. He then knelt and placed something at the base of Emma's headstone. It was a new wooden horse, freshly carved from a piece of pale aspen, its lines almost identical to the one in Emma's old room. It was not a replacement, but an acknowledgement, an act of acceptance. He was honoring his past while finally fully embracing his future. He was sharing his lost daughter with his new one. As they walked back toward the warm, welcoming lights of the ranch house, the sun setting behind them, Ruby, who had been quiet and contemplative, stopped and looked up at him. Her dark eyes were serious, filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. "My first papa taught me about justice," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You taught me about home." Silas's heart swelled. He squeezed her hand gently, unable to speak, past the lump in his throat. Together, they continued their walk, two survivors hand in hand, their long shadows stretching out behind them, leaving the ghosts of the past to rest peacefully on the hill as they moved toward the promise of a shared future.